Today is Tuesday, January 11th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And today I'd like to meditate and talk about the costs of homeschooling. The costs of homeschooling. And by costs, I don't mean a talk about how much money it costs to homeschool or how to save money on homeschooling. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the much bigger picture of all of the sacrifices, all of the work, all of the costs that are required for homeschooling. Because homeschooling, from the beginning, since the 1980s and 1990s, has been driven by book sales, homeschool advocates have always been urging Christian families to pull their kids out of schools and homeschool. And the motivation behind this advice has been a reckless and selfish interest in selling homeschool products. Back in the 90s, the homeschool conference was the big thing, and it was just a giant book sales convention. All the booksellers would come. They'd have all their tables set up. They'd all have their books and catalogs and all their supplies for sale. And then the speakers would come and speak and get everyone excited about homeschooling and send them out to the tables to start buying. They were just giant book fairs, giant book sales. And much of homeschooling has been driven by this constant publishing of homeschool materials and urging on of Christian families to pull the kids out of school and start buying homeschool supplies. It was a great marketing plan for these people, and many people have become very wealthy selling homeschool supplies. But it's reckless and foolish, and I would bet that if we could actually get feedback from all of the families through the years who have chosen to homeschool following the advice of these booksellers and conference speakers, we'd find that the experiences and the results of most homeschooling families has been quite bad. And I know that we can point out exceptions, but I'd be willing to bet that the overall experience of people who have been lured into homeschooling will have been found to be pretty bad. And the reason why, like I said, is that this call to homeschooling, this homeschooling movement, has been driven recklessly and selfishly by people who are eager to sell the homeschooling supplies to the families that take their advice and pull their kids out of schools. The problem with homeschooling, and just to make this clear, I am in support of homeschooling. I believe that homeschooling is the future of education. However, I don't believe that what most people think of when they talk about homeschooling is what homeschooling needs to be. I certainly don't think that the homeschooling of the 1990s is the homeschooling of the future, and yet in most circles, that remains the homeschool culture. I believe that homeschooling, and to just get out of even using this dopey phrase, homeschooling, I believe that self-paced, private education is the future of education. I believe that the days of the brick and mortar schools are behind us. I believe they're obsolete. But I believe they're going to continue not because of anything that has to do with education, but simply because parents in our society, men are not willing to work to provide for their families, and they just take it for granted that their wives will go out and find jobs to help pay the bills, and those families will always need schools to watch their children. Like most modern moral issues, I think the inability for modern children to enjoy the benefits of what's available to them through modern communication and educational technology is denied them by lazy fathers who, unwilling to work to provide their children with the opportunities that are available, force their children to attend schools because their mothers have to go to work. The families that do choose to homeschool, I would argue that almost all of them don't have a realistic plan for homeschooling, and they really have no idea what the costs are for effective homeschooling. I don't think they have any respect for the challenges of homeschooling. I don't think they have any respect for the needs of their children. I think all of these things are greatly underestimated, and the effort that's put forth by the parents is nowhere close to what it needs to be to effectively educate the children at home, to make the benefits and opportunities available to their children realities at home. They simply don't have the goal set where they need to be set. They don't have a realistic sense of the challenge that they face, the difficulty and the duration of the work that needs to be done. And their reactions to the problems that they encounter in homeschooling are reckless and selfish. And I'd like to talk about this a little bit. Now, remember, I've been working in education full-time for over 20 years. And I've been interacting with homeschool families throughout that entire time. Even though the CLAA only started in 2009, when I started dealing directly with homeschool families, or I should say 2008, I spent 10 years in private schools where we still have to interact with homeschool families because there's all kinds of relationships between private schools and homeschool families. Either we have homeschool children who are brought into private schools to make use of certain services like standardized testing and things like that, or we have homeschool students coming into the private schools and we had to work to help those students find their place and adapt to school life, or we have students leaving private schools to go and be homeschooled. There's all kinds of different relationships between a private school teacher and homeschool families. So even when I was working in the private schools, I was still dealing with homeschool families. A lot of my initial lessons about homeschooling came from my interactions with homeschooling families either in church or in private schools. I would say that in general, those families gave me a good opinion about homeschooling, about the potential of homeschooling. I'm not anti-school. I'm not the kind of person who buys into all the conspiracy theories and all of the ignorant talk about what the schools are quote-unquote trying to do and all. That stuff is irrational. If you hire a Muslim teacher to work at your school, he's going to have a Muslim influence. If you hire a homosexual teacher at your school, he's going to bring a homosexual influence. If you hire a Baptist, there's going to be a Baptist influence. If the community is largely atheist, the public school is going to have a largely atheist personality. That's not because there is some conspiracy in the works. It's just because of the people who are actually involved in the work of the school. If you want your children to be taught according to your beliefs, you need to seek out a school where the people working and running the school share your beliefs. And if everyone who shares your beliefs is too lazy to organize and start a school, well, then you're not going to have a school that teaches your beliefs. But you shouldn't start criticizing those who do start schools and those who do work in schools because they're promoting their own ideas. That's their right to do that. After all, they're the ones doing the work to start and run the schools. When you look around and see thousands of Catholic adults with all kinds of opinions, voicing their convictions and all these things, talking about how serious they all are about religion, and then you see that there's no school by and for such people, you see that the talk is a bunch of baloney. The people actually starting and funding and managing schools are the people who actually put their beliefs to work. And one of the reasons why many homeschool is because these groups of people aren't capable of or aren't willing to do the work of starting and running a school. So homeschooling in the past, I would argue, is in a certain degree a cop-out from the greater challenge of starting a school. But fast forward 20 years, or even 30 years, and I think the brick and mortar school is obsolete. The fact that we take children who sit at home with high-speed internet access from the dining room table to any resource that the school has access to, we see that the brick-and-mortar school with a library and a computer lab and a laboratory and classrooms and teachers, we see that that structure is obsolete. It's no longer essential. In fact, it is likely a hindrance because in a local school, children are limited by what quality of instruction happens to be available at their local school, and the internet changes all that. The internet gives children access not to whoever happens to be the local teacher, but to the best teachers, the best and most active teachers who are willing to teach in a strategic way and make their instruction available on the internet to students everywhere. That's the main reason why I believe that in 2022, the brick and mortar school is a dead man walking. It's just a matter of time. Every new bad experience, every new school shooting, every new teacher scandal, every new story of a teacher having relations with children, every new story is going to be one more arrow in the body of this stumbling brick and mortar school. And it's not going to be long before it starts to crash. And homeschool parents have to ask the question, what do we actually need to do to educate our children? What do we actually need to do? And I think we need to step back and think about this, because like I said, I don't believe that homeschool parents have any realistic sense of the greatness of the work that they're undertaking, especially when they say that they're not merely homeschooling their children, but they're providing a Christian education or a Catholic education to their children at home. I don't think parents take enough time to think about what that work actually will require. I don't think parents have enough respect for the work that's needed. I don't think they have a respect for the needs of their children. I don't think they have a realistic plan for homeschooling, and I'd like to talk about that. We live in a society where the Christians are not like Christians in past generations. They're not the kind of people who build and take over and direct temporal affairs. The Christian laity is lazy and inactive. The way that Christians who claim to have convictions express those convictions is by walking out of churches, withdrawing from schools, boycotting businesses, and all of these other actions they're just actions of retreat, actions of surrender. And Christians pretend that surrendering and retreating is some kind of show of conviction, when it really simply removes them from having any influence. Modern Christians don't see themselves as being responsible to collaborate as a community to build and overcome. We don't see Christians working to create new solutions, better solutions. We don't see unbelievers turning to the Christians for help. We don't see society looking to Christians as the better and wiser and more generous and more diligent people who can solve their problems. We see the opposite. We see Christians dependent on unbelievers for almost everything. And then we see Christians pretending that by criticizing the work that others do, they're somehow superior. They have higher standards. And this idle, self-deceived criticism is a vice of modern Christian society. The way that it affects homeschooling is that Christian parents imagine that because they can criticize the schools, because they can find fault with the schools, point out all the flaws and failures of the schools, and withdraw their children, that they've somehow accomplished something. And if you were to think 30 years ago, if a kid stopped going to school, he was called a dropout. He simply stopped going to school. And most kids who were criticized as being dropouts quit school and went to work instead. But they were criticized for taking a short-term course of action, thinking that an immediate job that puts some money in a kid's pocket was more valuable than finishing high school and earning a diploma. And they were called dropouts because they did less. They chose less. They would accomplish less. And in most cases, they did accomplish less. We can find extraordinary cases, but the exceptions prove the rule. The fact that we identify this one or two or three individuals proves that it's not a good plan. We can find individual exceptions for anything. I can show you pro athletes who live on junk food. It doesn't mean anything. But Christian parents have managed to buy into this new homeschool delusion that by dropping out of school, you're somehow superior to the kids who continue in school. When a parent withdraws a child from school, at that point, the child is simply a dropout. Criticizing the school, pointing out the problems with the school, and pulling the kid out of the school is simply to drop out of school. The problem with this mindset, which is usually urged on by other people doing the same thing, and especially by people who are excited to sell them the supplies that they're going to need. The problem with this dropout mentality, which they simply rephrase to sound noble, like we're pulling our children out of school or we're going to homeschool. Well, that's only true if you actually positively homeschool. If you simply pull the kids out of school, they're dropouts. But what these parents, or how these parents err in this, is that in their negative focus on flaws in the modern school, these parents take for granted and ignore the many benefits that the school offers. They underestimate the value of the benefits of schooling, and they exaggerate the negatives or the flaws of the schools. And let me explain. One thing you can count on is that if your child is enrolled in a school, you can count on the fact that there's going to be school 180 days of the year. And I'm not talking about last year with COVID. Obviously, that's an exception. I'm 46 years old. That has never happened in my lifetime. You're talking about an extraordinary, isolated situation. Not any kind of pattern or common experience. If your children are enrolled in school, you can be certain that year after year, the school is going to be open 180 days per year. And you're going to be able to drop a kid off at the front door of the school, and there's going to be a team of adults watching your child, making sure your child follows rules, keeping a schedule for your child, guiding the child through lessons, testing, grading your child, punishing your child when he or she is bad. On and on. There's going to be resources available to your child, services available to your child, facilities available to your child, activities available to your child. All of these benefits, all of these positive things provided by the school. If it's a public school, you won't even need to pay for them. If it's a private school, they'll be included in the cost of tuition. But you need to make a list of all of these benefits, all of these helpers in principals, guidance counselors, teachers, coaches, music teachers, gym teachers, sports coaches, art teachers, language teachers, science and math teachers, history teachers, English teachers, on and on and on. And while you can find faults with them, you can find faults with the activities, you can find faults with the instruction, you can find faults with the culture. Those faults can be listed in a second column. But there are a lot of benefits in that first column. There are a lot of benefits in that first column. Simple things we take for granted, like the fact that when I was a kid growing up, I had to get up early in the morning and get my butt to school because The bell would be ringing at 7:30. Classes would be starting at 8 o'clock. I had to get up, get dressed, and get to school. And once I got to school, I had teachers on me from the time the first bell rang until the dismissal bell rang at the end of the day. And when that last bell of the school day rang and I got outside, I felt relief that those teachers were finally off my back. And then I would go out to sports practice and spend another 2 hours with thousands of dollars of equipment, a number of men helping me, teaching me, coaching me. And I'd get finished on a high school day around 6:30 and head home. My parents didn't see me from 7:30 until 6:30, and I was under adult supervision the whole time. And while I can look back as a kid and say, yeah, there were a lot of bad things, most of the bad things I experienced came from other kids, not from my teachers. My teachers were on me all the time. I still remember some of the lessons that I learned. Freshman year in high school, I came into high school as a athletic hotshot. And I had a math teacher who stared me down in class one day and told me that my blue eyes were not going to get me through life. And she was on me every single day. Mrs. Aspercolis. I had a history teacher who pulled me aside after class one day as a freshman. I remember it was the day of a football game. I had my jersey on in school because we wore our jerseys to school on the days of games. And he pulled me aside and took hold of my jersey and warned me that he could see to it that I never step on a football field again. My teachers were on me. I went to school and I had to behave because there were teachers watching my every move. So my point in saying this is that there were a lot of benefits my parents received through sending me to school. My daily schedule, supervision, accountability, punishments if I was behaving badly, on and on. If I didn't get good grades, I couldn't play sports. If I fooled around in school and got a detention, I'd miss sports practice and get in trouble with my coaches. I was under discipline at school. There were a lot of benefits. And what I'm afraid of is that when parents start listening to the reckless and selfish homeschool cheerleaders who are usually salesmen, all that they do is amplify the negatives, exaggerate, and even misrepresent many of the negatives. And they urge them on to reckless decisions, focusing entirely on the negatives. And like I said, blowing them often out of proportion and completely neglecting and ignoring all of the benefits. And what happens is the homeschool parent makes the decision to keep the kid home from school, and at that point the kid is a dropout. There's no more schedule, there's no more supervision, there's no more accountability, there's no more language teachers, math teachers, science teachers, history teachers, gym teachers, art teachers, music teachers, no more lunch ladies, No more playground supervisors, no more playground, no more gymnasium, no more science lab. All of these benefits are lost. All of these benefits have to be replaced by the work and provision of the homeschool parents. And I'm not saying that a carbon copy of the public school or the private school needs to be reproduced at home, but many of these benefits have to do with behavior, supervision, schedule, routine, accountability, and so on. These things are non-negotiables. These things have to be replaced in the homeschool, or the kid is going to simply be a dropout. And the motor that needs to drive the homeschool is the parents. And this is why I say, this is the topic of this talk, I do not believe that people who work in homeschooling take responsibility for the difficulty of this work of homeschooling. It's not convenient for the booksellers and the homeschool publishers to talk about these things, because it would scare the heck out of most parents thinking about homeschooling. They don't talk about them. And what's even worse, and this is one of my main concerns that I want to talk about, what's even worse about the homeschooling community is, instead of accepting this challenge, taking responsibility for these taking responsibility for providing these benefits and acknowledging these potential dangers, what the homeschool community does is simply scoffs at them. They simply pretend like any talk about these things is stupid. And so I notice two things that develop among homeschool families. I see these things every day. The first thing that happens is this whole crazy philosophy of homeschooling emerges that's called unschooling. And these crazy people begin to pretend like losing all of the benefits of formal schooling is a good thing. Like losing the daily schedule is a good thing. Losing the discipline is a good thing. Losing the supervision and accountability is a good thing. Losing the good peer pressure that makes you brush your teeth and put deodorant on and dress decently and brush your hair and wash your face and watch your weight. The good peer pressure that comes through schooling is said to be something that no one needs. And this unschooling culture pretends like it's intentional, like it's desirable, like this is real Christianity, this is real family life. Getting up late, not getting washed and dressed in the morning, having a messy house, not having a schedule, not having any personal discipline, doing whatever you want, studying whatever you feel like, if you feel like it, wandering around the house. These deluded people actually pretend that this is a good thing, and that these kids are not simply living like dropouts. Let me ask you a question. Do you believe that a monastery is more like a school or the unschool family experience? Do you think the monastery, have you ever visited a monastery? Do you think the life of a monk or a nun is more like the life of a school student, or like the life of the unschooled homeschool kid? Obviously, that's a rhetorical question. The monastic life, which is considered to be a way of life necessary for spiritual growth in the pursuit of Christian perfection, a life that's ordered to promote holiness in the men and women who live in the monastic community, is strictly disciplined, scheduled, ordered, etc. As I said, school is beneficial because it creates and provides a lot of that structure and accountability and discipline. This unschooling idea, especially the fact that it's presented as somehow Christian, is just absolute insanity. These people deserve the visits that they get from social services. And the reason why they live in fear of social services is because they have guilty consciences. And they know that what they're doing is terrible. But the fact that they would put on this front and pretend that the chaos and laziness and disorder of the family is somehow a sign of Christianity, as opposed to the scheduled orderliness and accountability of the school, is just nuts. And so what happens is when people pull the kids out of school, they suddenly realize, like, oh my goodness, this is out of control. You can see if you join homeschool groups on social media, you'll see parents writing these SOS help messages saying, I have no idea what I'm doing, everything's a mess, I'm stressed out, my kids aren't accomplishing anything, they're falling behind in all of their studies, what do I do? You see this distress SOS message posted to social media, and then you'll see these loonies start responding, telling this mother who can see that this is a disaster unfolding, and they begin telling her that everything is fine, that this is the benefit of homeschooling, that she doesn't have to worry about what anyone else says, that she needs to stop pressuring herself and thinking that because she's not keeping up with the school or doing what other kids are doing, that something's wrong, but she should just feel free to do whatever she wants because that's the benefit of homeschooling. And they just start encouraging her to basically deny the reality of what she's experiencing, to ignore the red flags all over the place, as she watches her kids become school dropouts, and she's encouraged to simply deceive herself and tell herself that this is how it should be. And this is the unschool movement. They actually pretend like there's a philosophy to it. They talk about it explicitly, as if it's some kind of achievement. Unraveling the discipline and structure and order of school life is talked about as if it's some kind of achievement. Letting the kids just lay around and live easy in the house. Oh, we're unschooling. We're just unraveling all these terrible things that schools have introduced to our kids. Like what? Like a daily schedule? Like eating only at lunchtime? Like not walking around unwashed and undressed half the morning? Not staying up until 1 o'clock in the morning watching videos and playing games because you have to get up the next morning to get to school? Those are the negative things you're rooting out of your kids' lives? It's nuts. It's nuts. Those were the good things in your kids' lives. And when you start to think, you say, well, what actually were the bad things? What actually were the bad things of being in school? Well, those are the things that you should be focusing on adding in the homeschool and improving on. All of the benefits need to be retained, and the flaws need to be improved on. And this is why I always say, you can tell when people are deceived because their ideas justify them doing less, lowering the standards, becoming less disciplined, less diligent, less spiritually minded, less devout. Those are always the signs of deception. The reason why people don't like to serve God is because He's a God of commandments. The reason why people don't like monastic life is because it's a life of discipline and self-denial. The reason why people don't like Catholicism is because it's a life of humility and obedience. Anytime you find an idea that's unraveling these virtues, you should know you're headed down a bad path. Because going from disciplined to undisciplined, from structured to disorganized, from productive to unproductive, is never God's will. And yet in homeschool circles, this is almost celebrated by these crazy unschool people. So that's one crowd, and that's an extreme group, but by extreme, I don't mean unpopular. It's very popular. In fact, like I said, if you go on a homeschool group and post that you're concerned about something, you're going to find that the responses are not encouraging, expert suggestions for how to improve things. You're going to find that the responses are just dismissing comments saying things like, oh, it's okay, don't worry about that, do whatever you want, they're your children, it's your homeschool. You're going to see that all of the comments are just encouraging this careless response to perceived problems. The other thing that homeschool parents do, the other negative response to this problem, is that they dumb down the curriculum. I used to tell my wife, homeschooling will degenerate into bare bones public school studies, if that. But the point is that the homeschool will no longer be seeking something more excellent than what's available in the school. The homeschool activities, the homeschool content, the homeschool curriculum, the study materials, and so on will continue to degenerate and get dumber and dumber until they finally fit what the parent can do with the children in a disorganized, chaotic, uncommitted, and unskilled homeschool environment. If you come to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, there's a lot to learn because we're pursuing excellent things. We're pursuing a virtuous life. We're pursuing real wisdom. We're trying to imitate the saints and restore the standards of education that were once considered normal in Catholic schools. We're working to restore a monastic-like spirit and culture that seeks a contemplative life. We're seeking to restore orderly households where a husband understands and fulfills his role, where a wife understands and fulfills her role, where children are rightly taught about their responsibilities. And that life is constantly challenging. It's exhausting, it's lonely, it's difficult, and the biggest obstacle is that there is a ton to learn along the way. There is so much to learn, and I'm not talking about the academic content. I'm not talking about the content of the lessons or the curriculum. I'm talking about how much there is to learn about how to live that life, how to study the right way, how to teach your children how to order your home. There's so much to learn. And the only person who can pursue the benefits that are available to us are parents who come into homeschooling with a realistic sense of the responsibilities and the goals and the sacrifices and the costs and the challenges and the duration of time over which this work has to be continued. My oldest child was born in 2000. My youngest child was born in 2014. That means my years of parenting minors and homeschooling is going to stretch from the year 2000 to the year 2032. Homeschooling in my life will have been a 32-year work. 32 years. And it extends even beyond that, because just because the kids reach 18, things don't stop. Now they're in college, they need different kinds of help. They need different kinds of support. It goes on, but what I'm saying is this is a 30-year undertaking. And I don't believe that parents take it seriously. This is, if you're a layperson with children, this is likely the most important work you will do in your Christian life. And you still have other responsibilities. You still have to earn a living. But when you start making human children Every time a new baby arrives, you're locked in to a contract with that child, and you're responsible to provide for the physical and spiritual needs of that child as far as parenting is concerned. And you have children over a 10, 15-year period, and that extends to 20, 25, 30, 35 years of your life. And like I said, all of your other responsibilities still need to be taken care of. And if you screw this up, you're going to bring living hell upon your own life and family life. Some parents simply look away when things start to go wrong. It's very easy for a dad to say to his son or daughter, when you're 18, you need to move out. Boy, that was convenient, wasn't it? That's convenient. To bring a child into the world, have that child struggle, and not see yourself as the child's helper, but see that child as an inconvenience in your way that you can simply dismiss when he or she reaches his 18th year. That's convenient, isn't it? Let's just hope God doesn't do that to us, treating us the way we treat our children. Or when God looks upon us and sees us with all of our needs, let's hope that He doesn't respond to us the same way that we respond to our children. In fact, we don't expect Him to do so. We expect the opposite. We expect Him to be the parent to us that we have no interest in being to our children. And that's our hypocrisy. This work of homeschooling requires an incredible commitment to self-improvement as a parent, to study, self-discipline, real spiritual life, true devotion, sacrifice. And you're going to find that what you lack and what prevents you from undertaking this work is that you lack grace. And this is why it's actually good for us. This work of parenting and education, I'm just going to tell you, is ugly, unhappy work. I know that in our generation where Catholicism has been influenced by Protestantism, and there are many, I would say most Catholics trying to pretend that marriage and family life is the blessed life. There are no religious vocations, by the way, because we despise the religious life, the life that our Lord Himself lived and that most of the saints lived, despite all the talk about saints and how much we love Jesus. Protestant ideas about marriage, that marriage is the highest calling, and that having a family and bearing children is the blessed Christian life, because we quote passages from the Jewish Old Testament, and rather than interpret them in light of their spiritual fulfillment in the Christian life, we keep them in their Jewish context, as if we ourselves are Jews. And we read about the blessed life of the married man whose wife is like a vine at his table, whose children are like young olive plants and his daughters like polished cornerstones. We read these psalms in their Jewish temporary context rather than in their Christian fulfillment. And I know this may be getting a little deep. We say things like, God told Adam to be fruitful and multiply. Therefore, Christians fulfill God's will by being fruitful and multiply. That's Old Testament teaching. What does Jesus say in the New Testament? He says, go into the world and make disciples. Evangelization in the kingdom of God, in the Christian era, is the new commission. We're no longer commanded to go into the world to be fruitful and multiply. We're allowed to. If someone is going to have any sexual activity, it's for the sake of procreation. We're free to marry. Marriage is elevated to a sacrament. But the Church very explicitly teaches that virginity for the sake of the kingdom of God, or I should say celibacy for the sake of the kingdom of God, is more excellent than marriage. And the reason why is because a man who is not entangled in domestic affairs, in producing children, being responsible for the physical needs of children and so on, is free to serve the spiritual mission of the Church. This is the point of religious life. This is the life that our Lord himself lived, the life that John the Baptist lived, the life that many of the apostles lived, the life that most of the canonized saints lived. I would think the life that almost all of the doctors of the Church lived. But we've allowed Protestantism to bring its ideas of this sort of Christian Jewish family life into Catholic circles, and this has been influenced by groups like the Theology of the Body Institute. Not Pope John Paul's teaching on the theology of the body, but the lay movement that sort of takes that and turns it into all kinds of programs and products and runs with it into places that I don't believe it was intended to go, especially when you think that the author of the talks on the theology of the body was a celibate man. But we've allowed these romantic, Victorian, fictional images of family life and romance and marriage and these things to delude us from the truth of the difficulties of family life. And many people run into these things being, like I said, urged on by reckless advisors who are not going to be around when you need help. And when you're stuck in the midst of this life and you start to realize that making babies is one thing, parenting 6-year-olds is one thing, breastfeeding 2-year-olds is one thing, but teaching teenagers, directing and guiding and disciplining young adults or teens becoming adults in the presence of a million outside influences that you're never going to completely block out requires so much spiritual strength and grace, so much wisdom, so much vigilance, so much discipline, that if you don't start cultivating that strength and that discipline, if you don't start accumulating that wisdom when the children are young, by the time the troubles come and your fantasy bubble bursts, it's too late for you to start learning. It's too late for you to backtrack and fix the mistakes. Once water is let out, it's impossible to draw it back in. And this is why, from the very first moment that you entertain the idea of homeschooling your children, you better have a plan in place, not for them, but for yourself, as a husband and a wife working together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to fulfill the obligations that you have for the lives of these children that you produce and you choose to educate at home. You weren't assigned these children. You weren't laying out on the back porch one day and a stork delivered a baby and said, "Hey, God has said that you need to take care of this thing." As parents, we choose to marry and to produce children. We volunteer for the work of raising Christian children. We take upon ourselves promises and obligations when our children are born. And these are grave responsibilities. If you don't have a serious plan, if you don't have reliable advisors giving you good counsel, talking to you seriously and honestly about the challenges that you face, if you don't have a realistic sense of the difficulty of the work that a homeschooling parent has to continue to supply all of the benefits that were available in school and going beyond them to improve upon and replace the flaws of that school program. If you don't have support and resources that can actually serve you and your children, I didn't just say your children, I said you and your children, through what are going to be decades of parenting and homeschooling, I don't know what you're going to do. And this is why I say I don't think homeschooling parents are taking this work seriously. I don't think they're counting the costs. I think they're allowing themselves, because of this modern, lazy, critical Christian spirit, to think that pulling the kids out of the school and high-fiving all of your homeschool buddies is some kind of achievement. And now that you've done that, heaven is just going to open up and pour blessings upon you and your children because you've dropped out of school. You're nuts. You are now the school. You are now the principal and the teacher and the guidance counselor and the gym teacher and the music teacher and the art teacher. You now are responsible for that education. You are the one who drives the schedule. You are the supervisor. You are the teacher who sits in detention with the bad kids. You are the bus driver. All of those essential works and tasks of the school now need to be carried out by the homeschooling parents. And dad, choosing to have kids, choosing to homeschool can't deceive himself and say, well, my job is just to go to work and pay the bills. No, that's what a man does who sends his kids to school. And he does that because all he needs to do is pay the tuition. If you're a homeschooling father, you're not just the guy who goes off to work for 8 hours and pays the bills. You're a homeschooling father who is actually principally responsible for the education of your children. It's not your wife's responsibility. She's subject to you. The children, when they're born, are not given your wife's name. They're given your name. They're your children. You're their Christian father. St. Paul said, fathers, train up your children. It's not your wife's job while you go and play at the office and hang out with your coworkers. You have to find a way to provide for your family that you produced by your own will, living a style of life that you choose, living in a house you purchased, living in a community you selected. You have to find a way to provide for your family, both physically and spiritually. And spiritual includes intellectual. That's not your wife's job. Your job is just to go punch in and out of the office. There are 22-year-olds at the office who can carefree punch in, punch out, go home and put their feet up. Not a homeschool father. Certainly not a Christian father anyway. You're not a single guy with a job. You're the head of a household. You may need to change your career so that you can fulfill both responsibilities. You may need to work 2 jobs so you can afford to hire help that enables you to fulfill all of your responsibilities. You may need to be able to hire help for your wife so that she can help you fulfill your responsibilities. You may need to find a way to work from home. I can tell you my schedule, I work overnight. When my kids go to bed, I take that time when the house is quiet, and after I've worked all day and have talked with them, helped my wife keeping the kids under discipline. When my family goes to bed, that's when I finally have quiet time to work. I could very easily dump my wife with the kids every day and go take an easy teaching job in a school in Charlotte and say, hey, not my job, I pay the bills. But this is my job. I'm the head of this household. Those are my children. She's my wife. I'm the head. I'm the one responsible. I created the whole Classical Liberal Arts Academy because I knew my children needed better education and it wasn't available. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy is an example of a homeschool father working to fix a problem and provide what his kids need. Imagine if there were 100 men working together to do that. So I'm not just picking on homeschool mothers and telling them that they have to work harder. I'm telling homeschool fathers, you may need to have to rethink your whole life if you choose to homeschool. Nobody cares if you make the mortgage payments and you raise a bunch of hoodlums. Nobody cares if the front lawn and the outside of your house looks nice and inside it's a disaster area. There are real challenges in this work of homeschooling, real costs that need to be counted, real responsibilities and objectives that require strategic planning and creative, resourceful planning from heads of households for how they're going to fulfill these responsibilities. Delegating everything to the wife is to simply abdicate your role as the head of the household. Wouldn't that be nice to just delegate, quote unquote, delegate every hard task that you don't like to somebody else, so you can walk around and say, oh, you screwed this up, this isn't good, you need to work harder, this needs to be better. Nobody needs that. That's not leadership. That's not what it means to have high standards. I don't think parents respect the work of homeschooling. I don't think parents take seriously how much work is needed, how much money is needed, how much time is needed, how many years of steady work are needed to fulfill the potential of Christian homeschooling. We can do it, but I don't think we're even in the right frame of mind to consider the project and the challenge that's in front of us. And I think that if we can get our minds, as Christian people, if we can get our minds to grasp how great the work is that needs to be done, then I think that we can find the resources and we can collaborate to get that work done. But until we take it seriously and set the goals where they need to be, we can't even imagine the work, the path, the tasks and the difficulty that have to be overcome, and we're not preparing for them, we're not planning for them, we're not organizing to achieve that work. We're letting the goals fall down lower than they were when our kids were in a school, or lower than they would be if our kids were in school, and we're just making excuses and pretending that, hey, I'm doing all I can. That's a bunch of baloney. We're not doing all that we can. We have a lot to learn. We have, as adults, we have to study. We have to learn to become more spiritually minded. We have to become more disciplined. We have to become more spiritually minded. We have to learn to live simpler lives because we've undertaken this work of homeschooling, and we can't live like people who aren't homeschooling. We have to learn what it means as Christian parents, as Christian men and women, what it means to provide our children with real Christian education. And until we get serious about that and set the goals where they need to be set, we're just going to keep making excuses and pretending that we meant to do all of these negative things. And we know that that's not true. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I've been working to restore the curriculum that our kids need, to be able to fix what's wrong with modern education. But in order for kids to even be able to do these studies, their parents have to structure and order and support their lives and provide them with the help that they need to make progress through these studies, not for a couple weeks, not for a couple years, but for 10, 15 years of steady work, steady progress. If we can learn to get our act together, to set our sights on goals that should be in our sights, and collaborate, we can do it. But we have to get more serious about this work of homeschooling. We have to stop pretending homeschooling is a project you just throw some workbooks at every September and that's it. This work is so much more profound, so much more challenging, so much more difficult, so much more expensive, so much more satisfying, I think. And we're simply not engaging with it enough. We're letting ourselves fail. We're letting ourselves settle for low standards. And I want to challenge you to take it seriously. Realize what a huge undertaking it is. And commit to working together to succeeding at it. Just think how awesome that would be, to succeed at that work. I get tastes of success here and there, lots of failure myself, lots of struggle and difficulty. A lot of that has to do with just trying to blaze a trail with no support. But I get tastes now and then of success, and I can imagine what it could be like. But there has to be a more serious pursuit among Catholic families if we're ever going to get there. God bless.